Vannor Reylor was always the quiet one, the boy who walked with his head down and spoke in whispers. But when police uncovered the decomposing bodies of his parents, Jarik and Senea Reylor, buried beneath plastic sheets in their own basement, they realized silence had been hiding something monstrous. Elmbrook was the kind of town people rarely noticed. Tucked between wooded hills and silent lakes, it gave off the impression that nothing bad could ever happen there. Families waved from driveways, children biked through leafy streets, and the loudest noise on any given day was the sound of sprinklers coming on in the morning. It was the perfect place to raise a family, or so everyone believed. The Reylors had lived on Willow Ridge Lane for nearly 2 decades. Their house, pale blue with white trim and rose bushes out front, looked like something from a postcard. Jarik Reylor, a respected civil engineer, often spent long hours at his firm, but never missed a town meeting. His wife, Senea, was the smiling face behind weekend book fairs, food drives, and church potlucks. Together, they were seen as the heart of their neighborhood. Their son, Vannor Reylor, however, was a mystery even to those who lived just a few feet away. At 23, he still lived at home, having dropped out of college without giving much explanation. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his responses were short and distant. He often walked around the neighborhood alone, earphones in, head down, never making eye contact. Some neighbors assumed he was just shy or perhaps going through something emotional. Others weren't sure what to think. He was polite, never caused trouble, and always brought the trash out on schedule. But there was something about him, something unreadable, unsettling. Still, Elmbrook wasn't the kind of town that pried. People believed in privacy, in giving others space. So when the Reylors stopped being seen in public for a few days, no one thought too much of it. Maybe they were on vacation. Maybe they were ill. Senea had mentioned to someone weeks earlier that she wanted a break. But then came the smell. It started as a faint, unpleasant whiff on the breeze. People thought it was a dead animal at first, perhaps something rotting in the woods nearby. Then it got stronger. Neighbors couldn't open their windows. The stench clung to the air like a wet blanket. One neighbor, Mrs. Gellner, who lived directly behind the Reylors, noticed it was worse near their backyard. When she peeked over the fence, she didn't see much, just the grass a little overgrown, and the back door tightly shut. But the odor seemed to come from there. Soon, complaints started reaching the local police. Not emergency calls, just concerns. Strange. Smell, the Reylors hadn't been seen. Something seemed off. Officer Meryl Daughtry was the one assigned to check in. She arrived on a Monday morning. The sky was overcast, the air still thick with that sour stench. She knocked on the door, waited. No answer. She knocked again, more firmly this time. Then, just as she was about to leave, the door creaked open. Vannor stood there, expression blank, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He looked pale, thinner than usual. He told her calmly that his parents were visiting relatives out of state. When asked about the smell, he shrugged and said maybe something had died under the house. Officer Daughtry wasn't convinced. Something in his eyes felt off, too steady, too rehearsed. She asked to come inside. Vannor hesitated, then stepped aside. The house was clean but unusually cold. The air smelled like bleach and something worse underneath. As she walked through the living room and toward the kitchen, she noticed the door to the basement was sealed with tape. Not locked, just taped shut, almost like someone wanted to pretend it wasn't there. That's when she made the call for backup. Within hours, more officers arrived, and a warrant was secured. No one in Elmbrook could have guessed what they would find beneath that suburban home. The Reylors, once the picture of a perfect family, had vanished without a trace. All that remained was their quiet, cold house, and the son who calmly answered the door. When the warrant was finally signed, the officers returned to the Reylor house just after nightfall. The neighborhood was unusually silent. Porch lights, flickered on as curious neighbors peeked through blinds, watching from a distance as marked patrol cars lined the street. Vannor stood motionless in the doorway, his face blank, as officers stepped inside. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just walked to a corner of the living room and sat on the edge of a chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Officer Daughtry and her team approached the taped basement door. The adhesive strip was heavy-duty, industrial, more than what someone might use for casual repairs. She peeled it back slowly and with a deep breath pulled the door open. A wave of air rolled up from the dark below, damp, chemical, and unmistakably tainted by something foul. The smell hit them immediately. All illusions of a normal household vanished. They descended the steps slowly, flashlights cutting through the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs was a room that didn't match the rest of the house. The concrete floor was stained and uneven. Plastic sheets were stapled along the walls and hung like curtains across sections of the space. A large, standing fan hummed quietly in the corner, circulating air in a way that made the smell worse, not better. And then they saw them. Two human forms, partially covered in thick plastic, lay side by side beneath an old workbench. Nearby, open bags of lime spilled white powder across the floor, some clumped together from dampness. The bodies were in an advanced state of decay, but even through the distortion of time and decomposition, the features of Jarik and Senea Reylor were unmistakable. Her wedding ring still clung to a finger. His watch, cracked and dusty, was frozen at 3:47. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just death and preparation. The way the bodies were wrapped suggested planning, not panic. This wasn't a sudden act of violence. It was arranged, controlled, almost clinical. Beside the corpses was a small black camera mounted on a tripod. Its light blinked red. It had been recording the entire time. An officer reached out and powered it down without watching the footage. The priority now was preservation, photographs, samples, every detail documented. But the sense of dread was already thick in the room. Someone had done this with care, with time, with intention. Upstairs, Vannor didn't react when he was placed. In handcuffs. His expression didn't change when they informed him of his rights. He kept his eyes down, occasionally glancing toward the front window as if he expected someone else to walk in and explain everything. But no one came. No one could. Evidence collection continued through the night. In the garage, investigators found multiple containers of bleach, gloves, masks, and an instruction manual for body preservation techniques printed from a dark corner of the internet. In the bedroom upstairs, hidden behind a false panel in the closet, was a second camera, this, one pointed toward Vannor's bed. Investigators couldn't explain why it was there. There was no footage stored locally, no card in the slot. It was just there, watching. Neighbors were stunned when they heard the news the next morning. Most refused to believe it at first. The Reylors? That kind family? It didn't make sense. They were the least likely victims. And Vannor? The quiet boy with headphones? He had never raised his voice, never caused a disturbance. But that was the thing about Elmbrook. People assumed silence meant peace. They assumed that nothing happened unless they heard it. In the coming days, news vans would flood the small streets. The image of the blue house with the rose bushes would become the face of a tragedy. But in that moment, on that cold, chemical-filled night, the truth began to come out. A family's final chapter had been written not with rage, but with eerie stillness, a locked basement, a frozen smile, and a son who showed no fear. After the bodies were removed and the house was sealed, investigators turned their attention to what might explain such a calculated and emotionless crime. The question echoed through every room of the police department. Why had Vannor Reylor done this? He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no reported conflicts with his parents. There had to be more, something hidden beneath the surface. The answer came not from the crime scene itself, but from Vannor's bedroom. His room was a portrait of obsessive order. The bed was made perfectly, the books on the shelf arranged by color and size, and every drawer contained its contents in tightly packed rows. The desk, however, held something unexpected. Locked with a digital fingerprint scanner, it opened only after forensic techs forced it. Inside, they found a sleek black laptop, still warm from recent use. Alongside it were two external hard drives, a stack of notebooks with precise, slanted handwriting, and a small black envelope labeled with a single word, "Witness." The laptop proved to be the first real key into Vannor's mind. On the desktop was a folder titled "Witness Me," and within it were hundreds of files, journals, photos, detailed sketches, and video clips. What began as what looked like ordinary personal writings quickly turned into something chilling. Vannor had kept a daily record of his thoughts for the past 4 years, documenting not only his feelings but his plans. It was clear that this wasn't a sudden decision. This had been building for a long time. He wrote of feeling like a ghost in his own house. He described his parents as replicas of flesh, accusing them of pretending to love, pretending to live, pretending to... He believed that they were not real people but weak imitators of human design, undeserving of existence. To Vannor, his act was not murder. It was a purification, a necessary step toward what he called the second birth. In his writings, he referred to himself as the vessel, someone chosen by a force he never named, to cleanse what was broken. Investigators were disturbed by the level of detail in his journals. He had tracked his parents' routines to the minute. What time they showered, when they took medication, how long they spent on the phone, even how much water they drank in a day. He created behavioral charts, prediction models, and even simulated different methods of killing them in fictional stories, complete with time-stamped entries and emotional impact ratings. Each file felt less like writing and more like data collection. The most unnerving files were the video recordings. Many were silent surveillance clips showing Jarik and Senea in the kitchen, reading in the living room, or sleeping. One video, however, was different. It was labeled "End Scene." Investigators debated watching it for hours before ultimately making the decision. The footage was grainy, set in the basement. Vannor stood in frame, wearing a plain white shirt and latex gloves. His parents sat behind him, tied to chairs, both unconscious or sedated. He looked directly into the camera and pressed record. What followed was deeply unsettling, not because of violence on screen, but because of his demeanor. He spoke in a monotone voice, describing his actions as if narrating a documentary. He explained his reasoning, step by step, pausing occasionally to look over his shoulder at the still forms behind him. The video ended with him placing the camera down gently, facing upward, and sitting cross-legged in front of it. He stared blankly into the lens for almost 2 hours without blinking or moving. The journals, videos, and notes painted a clear picture. Vannor saw himself not as a killer, but as an architect of transformation. In his mind, his parents' deaths were not crimes. They were evolution. He didn't run afterward because he believed he had already won. That belief would soon be tested in ways he never expected. But for the investigators, one thing was now horrifyingly clear. This wasn't about hate. This was about control. About dominance. About watching death unfold and thinking it made you God. After days of collecting evidence, the investigation took a sudden and alarming turn when forensic analysts uncovered a recently deleted file from Vannor's laptop. It was a travel itinerary, carefully planned, meticulously timed, and disturbingly thorough. Vannor had booked a one-way flight to Reykjavik, Iceland, scheduled for the following Thursday. The booking was made under the name Nolan Vec, a fabricated identity constructed with a forged passport, a fake international student letter, and a digital resume for a made-up job at a tech firm overseas. He had gone to extraordinary lengths to cover his tracks. What disturbed detectives most was that he didn't intend to disappear in chaos. He wanted to vanish cleanly, as if he'd never existed in the first place. Investigators also found that he'd been transferring small amounts of money to a crypto wallet under his fake identity for nearly 8 months. It wasn't much, but it was enough to support him for a while abroad. He had rented a studio apartment in Reykjavik under a different alias, and even purchased winter clothes and hiking gear in advance, all delivered to a nearby drop locker outside of town. Everything pointed to one thing. Vannor didn't just want to flee. He believed he had already succeeded. In his final journal entries, he wrote that the phase 2 of his plan would begin with his departure from the Tomb of Lies, referring to the family home. He believed no one would uncover the bodies for at least another month. He had soaked the basement in bleach, sealed the room, and manipulated the thermostat to slow the rate of decay. He had planned to leave behind a final video, a digital confession to be released only after he was safely out of the country. In his mind, it would serve not as an admission of guilt, but as a legacy statement. But a detail he hadn't accounted for changed everything. Days before his arrest, Vannor had ordered 10 industrial bags of lime to speed up the decomposition process. He had signed for the delivery himself, but wasn't home when the shipment arrived. The delivery driver, unsure of what to do, handed the bags off to a neighbor who was outside gardening. That neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Falren, accepted them without question, but the smell had already started to drift across her yard. She found it odd that Vannor never came by to collect the bags, and even odder when he claimed a few days later that he never ordered anything. Mrs. Falren, concerned, kept the signed receipt and made a brief note of the strange interaction in her daily planner. When news broke of the discovered bodies, she contacted police with the receipt in hand. That single slip of paper, dated and signed, placed Vannor at the center of the purchase and tied him directly to the scene. It was an oversight so small, so insignificant, yet it shattered his illusion of control. The police used this as the final piece to secure an arrest warrant. They knew he was preparing to leave and waited patiently. Surveillance units followed his every move in the final hours before his arrest. He visited a storage unit where his travel clothes and fake documents were hidden. He took a walk downtown and withdrew money from an ATM using one of his fake IDs. Then, late that night, he returned home. Investigators believe he went into the basement one last time, perhaps to say goodbye to what he thought was his masterpiece. But within minutes, the house was surrounded. Officers moved in quickly and quietly. Vannor was arrested without resistance. He said nothing. No questions, no denial. He simply looked around, almost confused, as if the world was reacting out of turn, as if his story wasn't meant to end here. He was led away in silence, the weight of his shattered plan sinking in with every step. To the outside world, it seemed justice had won. But for those who had seen the footage, read the journals, and understood the depth of his delusion, there was no celebration, only the chilling realization that Vannor Reylor believed his story was only just beginning. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Vannor Reylor's trial. Reporters filled every bench, their pens poised and cameras waiting. The Reylor house on Willow Ridge Lane had long been emptied and boarded, but the echoes of what happened inside still haunted the entire town of Elmbrook. Everyone wanted answers. They wanted emotion. They wanted to understand how a young man so seemingly quiet and invisible could harbor a darkness that deep. But what they got instead was silence. Vannor pled not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense team described him as delusional, unwell, and trapped in a severe psychological break. They presented psychiatric evaluations stating he suffered from paranoid personality disorder, dissociative episodes, and a rare form of cognitive detachment that caused him to view the world through a distorted lens. They argued that Vannor believed he was eliminating imposters, not killing his parents. That to him, the act wasn't murder, it was a mission. His attorney repeatedly called him a victim of his own mind, but the prosecution saw it differently. They painted a picture of cold, calculated premeditation. They displayed the spreadsheets, the video footage, the basement setup, and most of all, the journal entries. Page after page of detailed planning, mock executions, chemical testing, and self-reflections that showed total awareness. The prosecution said Vannor was not insane. He was obsessive. He had known exactly what he was doing and had taken every step to cover it up. His travel plans alone proved his clarity. Throughout the proceedings, Vannor sat motionless. He never cried, never spoke out, never showed regret or fear. When the jury watched the end scene video, many turned away halfway through. One juror reportedly asked to be removed after experiencing nightmares. The footage was disturbing, not just because of the content, but because of how calm it all was. It wasn't rage, it was ritual. One moment in particular stayed with the courtroom. The final journal entry, read aloud by the lead prosecutor, detailed Vannor's view of the trial before it even happened. He predicted he would be misunderstood. He wrote that the courtroom would fumble over truth like blind men in a burning cathedral. He believed the system could never comprehend him. He did not care about winning. He only cared that the world watched. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts: first-degree murder of both parents, abuse of a corpse, and attempted escape from justice. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no reaction from Vannor, just that same blank stare, as if his physical presence in the room was only a shadow of his real self, drifting somewhere else entirely. He was transferred to Cold Path Penitentiary, a high-security mental institution tucked deep in the northern forest. There, he was placed in solitary confinement. His cell was lined with thick, shatterproof glass, monitored by cameras 24/7. He never spoke to other inmates. He refused therapy. He spent most days pacing, writing in the air with his finger as if drafting another journal that no one would ever read. 1 month after his sentencing, a staff member discovered something strange. Vannor had torn apart his blanket into fine threads and used them to form patterns across the floor, spirals, symbols, and shapes that matched the ones found in his original notebooks. No one could decipher their meaning, but they were intricate and intentional. Some staff believed it was a form of communication. Others thought it was just a coping mechanism. But one guard, after seeing the symbols, put in for immediate transfer. He claimed they weren't random. He claimed they were instructions. Back in Elmbrook, the Reylor home was quietly demolished. No one wanted the property. No one wanted the memories. The town tried to move on, but the story lingered, whispered between neighbors, and remembered each time the wind changed. Vannor Reylor never confessed, never broke, and never stopped believing in whatever story he had written inside his mind, and somewhere in that silent prison cell, he continued to write, unfinished, unseen, and completely convinced that his legacy was only beginning.